My name is Linda, and I know that the story I am about to tell you will make many people judge me, and maybe rightly so, because I hated myself for months after everything happened, and even now, the guilt sits on my chest like a stone I cannot lift, weighing me down every time I think about how easily I threw away the trust of the person who loved me most, the person who believed in me without question. And sometimes I wonder if anyone could truly understand how someone could betray love not once, but in a series of choices that escalated beyond control, and I remember the exact moment it all began, though I wish I could forget it. I was 24 when I met Dylan, and I thought I had finally found the kind of love people spend their whole lives searching for, the kind that makes your chest tighten when you see them, that makes mundane days feel like something sacred, that makes you believe in forever, and Dylan was all of that and more. He was patient in a way that made my anxiety dissolve, thoughtful in ways that made me feel seen and cherished, and he remembered little details about me that even I sometimes forgot, like how I liked exactly 3 spoons of sugar in my tea, how I hated my hair getting wet in the rain, how I carried a tiny notebook everywhere for ideas and sketches, and he noticed all of it. We moved in together after a year, and for a time, it felt like the universe had finally aligned, that my heart had found its home, and I thought this was it. This was the story I wanted to live, the kind of love people write novels about. But life is sneaky, and forever is fragile. Dylan had just been promoted at work, and suddenly the man who used to send me little notes in my bag, who used to leave flowers on my desk for no reason, was a ghost in our apartment, absorbed in spreadsheets, meetings, and endless emails, coming home late with exhausted eyes and a distracted mind, and I found myself waiting for the warmth, the smiles, the little gestures that had once been effortless, but he was always tired, always preoccupied, and I felt invisible in a home I thought I had helped build. At the same time, I started working at a new marketing agency, and the energy there was intoxicating, fast-paced meetings, laughter that bounced off the walls, music playing in the background of brainstorming sessions, a world where ambition and adrenaline made everything feel alive, and I thrived in it. But it also made me vulnerable in ways I hadn't expected. That's when I met Greg. Greg was my team leader, the kind of man whose presence made a room tilt toward him without him even trying, whose confidence and charm were subtle but impossible to ignore, whose smile seemed to hold secrets and promises, and I was drawn to him in a way that scared me, but thrilled me at the same time. It started with small things, compliments on my work, jokes after hours, texts about projects that lingered just a little too long, and then a question: "Do you want to grab coffee after the meeting, just the 2 of us?" And I said yes, because I wanted to feel noticed, because Dylan's absence had left a space I hadn't realized I needed filled, and Greg was there to fill it effortlessly. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Greg offered to drive me home, and we sat in his car outside my apartment, the city lights flickering across the windshield, and he leaned toward me and said softly, "Vanessa, you deserve to be seen," and before I could think, he kissed me, and I didn't stop him, because for once, I wanted to feel something entirely for myself, something thrilling, something forbidden. That kiss turned into weeks of stolen moments, nights in his apartment while Dylan waited at home, nights where my chest hurt with excitement and guilt in equal measure, nights where I told myself it was nothing, it didn't mean anything, it was just one mistake. And yet it became more, a pattern, a dangerous rhythm that I couldn't escape, and I was living a lie I hated but couldn't leave, and my mind constantly replayed the moments, the words, the smells, the laughter, the way his hand felt on mine, the way Dylan looked at me with love and trust one didn't deserve, and the guilt became unbearable, but the thrill was addictive, because Greg made me feel alive in ways Dylan, exhausted and distracted, hadn't been able to for months. The turning point came on a Friday night. Dylan had planned a dinner for us, something we hadn't done in months. He left work early, bought the flowers I loved, the ones that smelled like spring, and his smile was tired but hopeful, the kind of smile that made me feel both safe and adored, and my chest twisted painfully because I knew I had to choose, and I couldn't. My phone buzzed, and it was Greg. "Come over. I need you tonight." I stared at that message, hands trembling, heart splitting in two, Dylan sitting across from me, waiting to give me a night I had begged for months earlier, and Greg dangling chaos and desire in my pocket, calling me to a path I knew was wrong, and I went. and in that single choice, I destroyed everything I had, every bit of trust, every ounce of love Dylan had given me, and from that night on, I knew there was no turning back, only consequences I had to live with, and even now, writing this, I feel the weight of that decision crushing me, a constant reminder that being human sometimes means making mistakes too big to forget, and that some choices, no matter how thrilling or tempting, leave scars that never fully heal. The night I went to Greg's apartment, everything felt surreal, like I was watching my own life unfold from a distance, as if I were a character in someone else's story, and the weight of guilt pressed on me with every step I took through his door, yet the thrill of being wanted made my heart race, and the smell of his cologne, the warmth of his apartment, the soft lighting that made the shadows dance across his walls, it all drew me in, and I found myself collapsing into his arms as if the world outside didn't exist, and in that moment, I convinced myself that I could compartmentalize my life, that Dylan and Greg occupied separate parts of my heart, separate realities, and that I could navigate them without losing either, but deep down I knew the truth, one day, everything would collide. Greg smiled at me, that confident, knowing smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, and he pressed his lips to mine again, slower this time, lingering, tasting, and I let myself be carried away, telling myself it was a choice, a moment of weakness, nothing more, yet I could feel the tension in my chest, the part of me that still loved Dylan, that still wanted to be the woman who was faithful, who deserved his trust, and I hated myself for betraying him, even as I gave in to desire. We talked, we laughed, and I noticed how easily Greg could read me, how he understood the unspoken words and the emotions I tried to hide, and I realized how starved I had been for attention, for validation, for excitement, for someone to look at me like I mattered completely, and Dylan had been so consumed by his own world that I had begun to fade from his sight, and I had let it happen, and now I was here, in Greg's apartment, and my phone vibrated constantly with texts from both worlds, and every notification made my heart jump, a dangerous game I was playing, a life on the edge of discovery, and it was addictive. Days passed in a blur of stolen moments and secret texts, little excuses to see him, moments in empty conference rooms, whispered messages that made my stomach twist with guilt and exhilaration, nights when I could barely sleep because I replayed every word, every touch, every glance, trying to justify my actions, telling myself that Dylan didn't notice, that he was too busy, that maybe he had taken my presence for granted, that maybe I wasn't being fair to myself, but every rationalization was a lie, and I knew it, and the tension built like a storm cloud, heavy, threatening, inevitable. Then came a weekend when Dylan had planned a small getaway, a short trip to a cabin in the woods, the kind of thing that used to fill me with excitement, the idea of disconnecting, of being together without distractions, and I should have felt happiness, but instead I felt dread, knowing I had to face him and carry the secret like a hidden knife in my chest, knowing that Greg would be waiting for me at home if I returned early, knowing that every choice I made was fracturing me, and the night before the trip, Greg sent a text, "I can't wait to see you. I need you. Don't leave me behind." My stomach twisted, my heart pounded, and I felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the food I ate. It was the weight of betrayal, the taste of fear and lust combined, a cocktail I had grown dependent on. I tried to put Dylan first, I truly did. I wanted to focus on him, to remind myself why I loved him, to find the joy in our moments, but the pull toward Greg was magnetic, irresistible, a craving that consumed me when Dylan wasn't looking, and I found myself making excuses, saying I was tired, saying I had errands, just to steal a few minutes, just to touch his hand, just to feel alive again. The cabin trip was a mix of nostalgia and fear, of laughter forced and smiles that felt brittle, because my mind kept wandering to Greg, to the text messages, to the nights I spent in his apartment, to the thrill and the panic, to the constant tightrope walk of keeping two lives balanced and knowing I was failing at both. On the second night, Dylan fell asleep early, and I lay awake, staring at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, thinking about what I had done, about the lies I had told, about the woman I had become, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks in the dark, the realization of my own weakness crushing me, but even as I cried silently, my phone buzzed in my bag, and it was Greg, and my heart leapt despite myself, and I had to resist the urge to respond immediately, to make a choice that would destroy the fragile balance I was desperately trying to maintain. By the third day, the guilt and the desire were equally unbearable. I had begun to fantasize about confessing to Dylan, to laying everything bare, but fear held me back, fear of losing him entirely, fear of shattering the world I had always dreamed I could live in, fear that the man who had loved me endlessly would walk away and never look back. And then it happened, the moment I knew my two worlds could no longer exist side by side. A text from Greg meant for another woman, one that had somehow landed in my inbox by mistake, filled with words of intimacy and excitement I had never experienced with Dylan, words that revealed how manipulative and possessive he had become, and I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that Greg was not what I had imagined, that the excitement had masked a dangerous side, that my attraction had blinded me to the truth, and for the first time, I felt the icy grip of fear over the warmth I had felt, and I knew that the choices I had made were leading me toward inevitable disaster, and that I had no one to blame but myself, that the life I had once treasured with Dylan was at risk, and the night in the cabin stretched long and endless, each minute a reminder that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and I lay awake, trembling, knowing that when we returned home, nothing would be the same, that secrets could no longer hide, and that the reckoning was only just beginning. When we returned from the cabin, the air in our apartment felt heavier, charged with tension I could almost touch, and Dylan seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, still smiling, still telling me he loved me, and my chest ached with a mixture of shame and longing because I wanted to tell him everything but feared the consequences, feared the loss of a love that had once felt infinite, and Greg, meanwhile, continued to send messages that tugged at me like strings, each one a temptation I couldn't resist, each one a reminder that I was leading two lives and that the walls I had built around my secret were thinner than I thought. The next week, I found myself walking to the subway, phone in hand, reading a text from Greg that made my palms sweat and my heart hammer, and I knew that the moment I replied, I would be stepping further into danger, yet I typed back without hesitation, my fingers trembling, my mind screaming at me to stop, and that night, I met him in a deserted coffee shop after everyone had gone home. The smell of coffee and faint cleaning supplies filling the air, and we talked, or maybe we didn't, because my thoughts were a jumble of guilt, desire, and fear, and he smiled at me with that same confident charm, that same magnetism, and I leaned closer to him despite the voice inside me telling me to run, and I kissed him, again, for what felt like the 100th time, and in that kiss, I felt alive and dead at the same time, like I was both breaking and reviving myself with every touch. Dylan, oblivious and patient, called me later that evening, asking about my day, asking if I wanted to spend the weekend together, and I lied, of course, saying I was tired, needing space, while my heart sank with every syllable, knowing that my lies were building a cage I could not escape from, and yet I continued, caught in the thrill of Greg's attention, caught in a web I had spun myself, and the contrast between the two men, one who loved me unconditionally and one who offered me forbidden excitement, tore me in two. A few days later, Greg came over under the pretense of work, and as soon as Dylan left for a late meeting, I felt my resolve crumble, my body craving what my conscience knew was wrong, and we ended up in the bedroom, tangled in sheets, the sounds of the city muted behind closed windows, and I thought I could pretend it was just physical, just a fleeting connection, but I was lying to myself, because my mind was obsessed, my heart racing, my guilt boiling under the surface, and I was aware that every moment of pleasure was also a dagger twisting in my chest. I started noticing patterns in myself, the anxiety, the constant need to check messages, the heart-stopping moment when Dylan would ask where I had been and I had to fabricate some story, the thrill of sneaking glances at Greg's texts while pretending to work or read, the sick realization that I was capable of betraying the person who had given me everything, the man who trusted me completely, the man who had been my home. And I hated myself more with every breath I took. One evening, Dylan suggested we invite friends over for dinner, and panic overtook me because I had to juggle pretending to be normal, pretending that everything was fine, while also hiding my secret from everyone, and I spent hours checking my phone, planning excuses, rehearsing lies in my head, and the night arrived, filled with laughter, food, and casual conversation, and Greg sent a text during the dinner, "I miss you. Can you come now?" My hand shook as I excused myself, claiming I needed to check something in the other room, and I slipped out of the apartment into the cool night air, my mind spinning with guilt, excitement, and fear, knowing that I was choosing the chaos over stability, knowing that my life was spiraling, and yet unable to stop. In Greg's apartment, I felt the intoxicating rush again, but this time, my thoughts were darker, more fearful, because I realized that my carefully maintained secret was fragile, that one wrong move could destroy everything, and yet I kissed him again, drew closer, whispered lies to myself, told myself that it was okay, that I could manage both worlds, that I could keep Dylan's love safe while indulging in this forbidden excitement, but I knew deep down that I was lying, that the walls around my deceit were cracking, and that the reckoning was coming. Days turned into a blur of guilt and ecstasy, and I became obsessed with the idea of being caught, with the thrill of sneaking around, with the knowledge that I was doing something I shouldn't, with the poison of my own choices twisting inside me, and I began to imagine scenarios where Dylan would find out, the look on his face, the heartbreak, the betrayal, and a cold sweat would break out on my skin at the very thought, but still, I couldn't stop, because Greg's attention, his touch, his presence had become a drug, and I was addicted, and every time Dylan smiled at me, every time he told me he loved me, every time he looked at me with hope and trust, I felt the knife of guilt twist again, and I realized that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a chasm I had dug myself, and that falling was inevitable. One late night, I sat alone in my apartment, Dylan asleep in the other room, Greg's messages buzzing constantly on my phone, and I stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the two halves of my life, the woman I wanted to be and the one I had become, and I realized with a pang that there was no going back, that my secret life had taken over my reality, and that the person I loved the most might never forgive me, might never understand, and yet the addict in me longed for the chaos, for the thrill, for the danger, and I understood in that moment that my story had reached a point of no return, that I was trapped in the consequences of my own choices, and that the coming days would demand that I face them. The days after that night were unbearable, and I felt like I was living in two separate realities, each one fragile and dangerous, and every step I took felt like walking on ice, knowing it could crack at any moment, and the weight of my choices pressed down on me like a constant drumbeat, reminding me that I was responsible for every lie, every stolen moment, every deceitful smile, and I hated myself more with each passing hour, but I couldn't stop. Dylan still loved me as if nothing had changed, still brought me coffee in the morning, still kissed my forehead when I woke up, still held my hand in public with the same gentleness I remembered from the first day we met, and it made the betrayal cut deeper, sharper, like a knife twisting in my chest that I couldn't remove, and Greg's messages, texts, and late-night calls made it worse, because each one was a temptation I couldn't resist, a reminder that I was addicted to the thrill, that I craved attention in ways that scared me, and that I was capable of hurting the one person who had given me everything without hesitation. One evening, I was at the office late, working on a campaign with Greg, and he leaned closer under the pretense of checking my notes, and I felt the heat of his body near mine, the brush of his hand, the scent of his cologne, and I knew that every time I touched him, every time I kissed him, I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, and yet I did it anyway, because the desire, the excitement, the sense of being alive was stronger than reason, and I told myself it was okay, that I could manage it, that I could keep Dylan and Greg separate, but I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. At home, Dylan would ask about my day, and I would give him rehearsed smiles, nods, and half-truths, and every time I looked into his eyes, filled with trust and love, my chest would tighten, because I knew I was poisoning the one person who deserved honesty the most, and yet I couldn't stop, because Greg's presence, even in my mind, had become a drug, a fire I couldn't extinguish, and I was addicted. Then came the night that changed everything. Dylan had planned a quiet dinner for us at home, candles, music, the kind of evening I had once dreamed of, and I was torn between excitement and dread, knowing that my phone would buzz at any moment, Greg's messages urging me to sneak away, to give in, and as I set the table, I felt my heart pound with anxiety and anticipation, and the walls around my deceit seemed thinner than ever. Dinner began normally, with small talk, laughter, and the comfort of familiarity, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not from happiness, but from the unbearable tension of leading a double life, and Dylan, oblivious, smiled at me, his love shining in his gaze, and I wanted desperately to tell him everything, to confess, to unburden myself, but fear held me back, fear that he would leave, fear that I would lose the only home I had ever truly known, fear that the life I had built with him would crumble in a moment of truth. That night, as Dylan stepped away to answer a phone call, Greg's name flashed on my screen, and I froze, torn between worlds, and my thumb hovered over the reply button, heart hammering, breath shallow, because I knew that sending a message would deepen the lie, would pull me further into chaos, and yet the temptation was irresistible, and I sent a quick text, careful, coded, and my pulse raced as I waited for a response. When Dylan returned, I smiled at him, forced laughter escaping my lips, the sound hollow even to my own ears, and we continued dinner, but the tension inside me was unbearable, a storm cloud threatening to break, because I knew the next decision I made could change everything. Greg replied almost instantly, words that made my stomach twist, desire, fear, and excitement all at once, and I realized that the life I had built with Dylan and the addictive world Greg offered could no longer coexist, that the walls between these two worlds were crumbling, and that the reckoning I had been avoiding was inevitable. In the days that followed, I began to notice signs that Greg's affection was not as pure as I had imagined, subtle manipulations, hints of possessiveness, messages meant to provoke jealousy, to test my loyalty, and I realized that the man I had been running to for excitement was not the escape I thought he was, but another form of danger, a force that threatened to destroy everything I loved, and I felt panic, guilt, and terror swirling inside me like a hurricane, because I knew that the next misstep could end the relationship with Dylan forever, and yet the addiction to being wanted, to feeling seen, kept pulling me back into Greg's orbit, and every moment with him felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, thrilling and terrifying at the same time. One afternoon, I caught Dylan looking at me with a suspicion I had never seen before, a quiet tension in his eyes, and my stomach lurched, because I knew that the walls I had built around my lies were cracking, that he was noticing the subtle changes in my behavior, the distracted glances at my phone, the nervous hesitation in my voice, and I felt the first sharp pang of real fear, the fear that my deception would be exposed, that the man who had trusted me most would find out, and that the consequences would be devastating, and in that moment, I knew that I could no longer hide behind the lies, that the reckoning was approaching, and that every choice I had made had led me to this inevitable point of confrontation, and that my life would never be the same. The day everything came crashing down started like any other, but I could feel it in my bones, a tension that had been building for weeks, a storm ready to break, and I knew there was no turning back, no hiding, no pretending anymore. Dylan had noticed the changes in me, the distracted glances at my phone, the nervous hesitation in my words, and the small lies that no one else would catch but him, and I could feel the quiet weight of suspicion pressing down on me like a vice, and it terrified me. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess, to let him decide if he could forgive me, to unburden myself from the guilt that had consumed me, but fear gripped me, the fear of losing the person who had given me unconditional love, the man who had been my home, and the man who had trusted me with everything, and I hesitated, even as the walls of my secret life began to crumble. Greg, meanwhile, had been acting differently, possessive, manipulative, testing me, and I began to see the danger in what I had created, the chaos I had willingly stepped into, and the addictive thrill that had once made me feel alive now made me feel sick, anxious, and trapped, because I realized that I had chosen a path that could destroy everything I loved. That night, Dylan asked me to sit with him in the living room, a quiet seriousness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, and my chest ached as I sat down, my mind racing, heart pounding, because I knew he knew something was wrong, knew I was hiding something, and the fear of losing him made my hands shake. "Linda," he said softly, voice calm but heavy, "I feel like something has changed between us. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it, and I need you to be honest with me." The words hit me like a blow, and the weight of my guilt became unbearable. I swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill, and I knew that the truth had to come out, that I couldn't continue living in lies, that Dylan deserved to know everything, even if it meant losing him forever. I took a deep breath and began to speak, words trembling as they left my lips, confessing every stolen moment, every lie, every text, every kiss, every night I had spent with Greg, every thought I had tried to suppress, and as I spoke, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, and the quiet sound of my confession echoed between us, unbearable in its intensity. Dylan sat in silence, listening, eyes wide, heart breaking, and I could feel every ounce of love I had for him twisting with guilt and shame, knowing I had shattered something irreplaceable. When I finished, there was a long, suffocating pause, the kind that stretches on, until it becomes almost physical, pressing on your chest, and then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Linda, I can't believe this. I trusted you. I loved you. And you." His words faltered, heavy with pain, and I could see the tears in his eyes, tears I had caused, and I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to beg for forgiveness, but I didn't, because I knew the damage was done. The next hours were a blur of conversation, tears, anger, and heartbreak, Dylan asking questions I couldn't answer without hurting him further, and me trying to explain my reasons, my weakness, my loneliness, the thrill of being seen by Greg, the emptiness I felt when Dylan was distracted, and yet, no explanation could undo the betrayal. Days passed in silence, tension thick in the apartment, Dylan retreating into himself, me drowning in guilt, and I realized the full weight of what I had done. I had destroyed the trust of the person I loved most, I had let desire and weakness override reason and loyalty, and I had invited chaos into my life that I couldn't contain. Greg's messages continued, but I didn't respond, because I knew that the affair was over, that I needed to face the consequences of my actions, that I needed to try to repair what I could, if anything could be repaired, and that meant cutting off the thrill I had been addicted to, facing the pain I had caused, and trying to live with the knowledge of my own mistakes. Eventually, Dylan spoke again, voice broken but determined. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Linda, but I need to know that you are willing to try, that you are willing to be honest from now on, because I can't live in a lie." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, heart shattering, and I promised, even though I wasn't sure if promises were enough, that I would be honest, that I would never lie again, that I would try to rebuild the trust one had destroyed, and I knew the road ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain, but it was the only path left. In the weeks that followed, I stopped contacting Greg, deleted his number, blocked his messages, and tried to focus on Dylan, who cautiously allowed me back into his world, slowly, day by day, teaching me that forgiveness is not given lightly, that trust is fragile, and that love, while powerful, can be broken in an instant by our own choices, and I learned, painfully, that actions have consequences, that desires cannot justify betrayal, and that the pain of hurting someone who loved you is a weight that lingers far longer than any thrill or temptation ever could. I cheated on my boyfriend, and I regret it more than I can ever express. The guilt follows me, the memories haunt me, the lesson is bitter, and yet, I survived it, and I hope that by sharing this story, someone out there will see that the choices we make define us, that love is fragile and precious, and that sometimes, the hardest thing we can do is face the truth of our own mistakes and try to live with the consequences, hoping that someday, somehow, forgiveness and healing can exist even after betrayal.